We're live streaming both USFL playoff games this weekend right here on Jaguar Gator 9. Make sure to tune in before we move into the new studio next week. And now, on with our feature presentation. Who's the worst head coach in the history of the Chicago Bears? Honestly, there are quite a few contenders for the bottom spot. Jim Dooley was sort of a train wreck taking over for the legendary George Halas. Mark Tresman and John Fox, despite having success as head coaches elsewhere, were both disasters when they got to Chicago, especially Fox, who won less than 30% of his games and failed to replicate the success that he had in Carolina and in Denver. However, if we're going strictly off of winning percentage, then excluding Matt Eberflus, seeing as he is the current head coach and has a chance to improve his percentage, many people would say that the worst head coach in franchise history is the man that you've been watching this whole time, Abe Gibron, who was more known for his weight than he was for his ability to lead a football team. In Gibron's 3 seasons with the Bears, Chicago was nothing short of abysmal, going 11-30-1, winning just 26% of their games, and with the team never having a single season with more than 4 wins. The Bears had less than 5 wins in all of Gibron's 3 seasons with the team. The Bears, who had been around since 1919, had less than 5 wins just 4 times in franchise history before he got there, in a time frame spanning more than half a century. That's how bad Gibron was, even if he might not have been given a whole lot to work with. This was the same coach that late in the 4th quarter in a tied game called a fake punt deep in his own territory for some reason, which, shocker, did not work out. You can learn more about that debacle by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Abe Gibron was an abysmal head coach who might have known what he was doing coaching a defensive line, but had no idea what he was doing actually manning an entire football team. Having said that, despite Gibron's awfulness as a head coach, you can't deny that he's quite the character. There had never been another person like Abe Gibron before, and half a century later, there has still never really been a head coach like Abe Gibron. He was one of a kind. I could tell a whole lot of stories about Gibron and his career, to the point where I could probably spend a month on just Abe Gibron's stories if I wanted to. That's how unique and eccentric he was. Heck, I already did a video about Gibron and a bizarre coaching moment that he had during a 1973 battle against the Denver Broncos, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. That game was one of the 11 games that Gibron actually won and emerged victorious in. And today's story involves another one of those rare wins. Imagine just hours before the game that the head coach is hospitalized with something bad. Against all the advice of the doctors, despite struggling like crazy, he checks out of the hospital to coach the game, and he somehow guides his team to victory against all odds. Well, to open up the 1974 NFL season, Chicago Bears head coach Abe Gibron did just that. Because this is the crazy story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances, the craziest moment and the craziest win in Abe Gibron's memorable coaching career. Before I talk about the actual game in question and how it played out, we need some context to understand not just the importance of this game, but to understand how Gibron was doing physically entering this one. It's September 15th, 1974. It's week 1 of a brand new season, and we've got a battle on our hands at Soldier Field in the NFC Central between 2 heated divisional rivals, in the Detroit Lions and the Chicago Bears. Aside from the fact that it's opening day of the season, and you always want to start the season off on the right foot, especially in front of your home crowd, and especially in a divisional game, this is a big game for the Bears, because the difference between starting 1-0 and 0-1 is surprisingly big. Back in 1974, only 4 teams made the playoffs in each conference, and in a 14-game season, there wasn't a whole lot of room for error. Consider this. In 1973, of the 4 teams to make the playoffs in the NFC that year, which were Dallas, Washington, Minnesota, and Los Angeles, all 4 of them started 1-0. In 1972, Washington, Dallas, Green Bay, and San Francisco represented the NFC in the playoffs. They all started 1-0. And in 1970, Dallas, Minnesota, Detroit, and San Francisco represented the NFC in the playoffs, with all 4 of those teams starting 1-0. Since the merger, only the 1971 San Francisco 49ers represented the NFC in the playoffs after losing the first game of the season. So in many ways, this game against the Lions was a must-win, as even though it was just the opening game out of 14, it set the tone for the entire season, as history was not on your side if you started 0-1. Again, just 1 out of 16 teams made the playoffs. Amazingly enough, even though we didn't know it at the time, you guessed it, all 4 teams that would make the playoffs from the NFC in 1974 started 1-0. And aside from this being a big game for the Bears, this was a big game for the man that you've been watching this entire time, head coach Abe Gibron. Following 2 really poor seasons in Chicago, he was on somewhat of a hot seat, especially after a poor 3-11 campaign in 1973, where the Bears not only finished last in the NFC Central, but finished only ahead of the New York Giants for the worst record in the conference. One of the chief complaints against Gibron, of which there were many, was that he couldn't beat Detroit. You've got to beat your rivals if you want to be a successful head coach. And Gibron had not done that whatsoever. In 4 games against the Lions since he took over the job in 1972, he and the Bears were 0-4, with none of those games being particularly close. It's not like the Lions were this juggernaut of a team either. The Bears just laid an egg under Gibron every time they played them. In 1972, the Bears got swept by losing 38-24 and 14-0. And in 1973, the Bears got swept again by losing 30-7, and in their most recent game in Week 13, losing 40-7. Combined under Gibron, the Bears were outscored 122-38 against the Lions, meaning that they lost each of those games by an average of 21 points. Obviously, that's abysmal. This opening game of the season was too important for Gibron, because he was fighting for his job and his reputation in this one. But the problem for Gibron? Well, he wasn't feeling all that healthy. At first, Gibron and his wife Sue didn't think it was anything serious. When Gibron came home from practice that day, he saw that he had a pretty nasty bump on his ankle. Alright, it stinks, but no big deal. Maybe he just ran into something during practice, and the pain would subside, and everything would heal quickly. But when Gibron put his leg up on a stool, he and his wife quickly realized that this was way more than just a swollen left leg. The pain went from his leg to his groin. The pain also went to his head, where he had what he described as a splitting headache. The pain also led to a fever of 104 degrees, which is potentially deadly. For some perspective, doctors recommend that for anything above a 103, you go to the emergency room immediately. You don't mess around with that. A 104-degree fever is really in that danger zone, where you can have some life-threatening problems if it's not handled properly and immediately. And if that wasn't bad enough, Gibron had no appetite. He hadn't eaten all day, and actually hadn't eaten since Friday. By itself, that's worrisome. But remember, this is Abe Gibron that we're talking about. This is a head coach that is known for eating, and that weighed somewhere in the ballpark of 330 pounds for the start of the season. He was as well known for his eating and his appetite as quarterback Ryan Fitzpatrick is known for his Harvard education, or tight end Antonio Gates is known for his basketball career. Said some former Hall of Fame teammates of his on the Cleveland Browns during his playing days, every time he went to dinner, it was a banquet. He used to eat until 2 o'clock in the morning. And said head coach Chuck Knox, "We had to get Abe 2 seats in the press box. He took up 2 spaces. We got him 2 trays of food." I can go on about the number of quotes and the detail of the quotes about Abe Gibron eating. So when Abe freaking Gibron is not eating, yeah, you know something's up. It's like when the Waffle House in the South closes during a hurricane. You know this is serious at that point, and that someone's life is on the line. With that, Gibron was admitted to the hospital on the night of September 14th, just a few hours before game time. And when he woke up, he was still in the hospital and was still feeling like crap. The pain had not subsided. If anything, it was worse than it was before. By this point, as his wife said, "It scared me to death when they took the bandages off, and I saw 2 bumps bigger than a clenched fist, and his groin had turned purple. His 104-degree fever was still there. It had not gone down. His headache was still there." For those wondering, as we would later find out, Gibron's physicians, Dr. Edward Winslow and Dr. Charles Laster, as well as the superintendent of the hospital, Gerald Mungerson, would diagnose him with cellulitis, which is a painful infection under the skin where a vein gets inflamed by a blood clot. And one of the best ways to heal from this is to rest and do as little activity as possible. Said Dr. Steve Geller, "He's just got to slow down and relax. He's been going at too fast a pace." So let's be real here for a second. This was a coach that was on the verge of potentially dying, who had a 104-degree fever, whose lower body was a color that it should not be, who was in immense pain everywhere, and who should be in a hospital and not anywhere near a football field. Someone else can take over as the interim coach for this game, even though it's the season opener, and literally everyone would understand. Think of how bad you feel with a 100-degree fever. We've all had it before. And now, think of how bad a 104-degree fever must be, and how you have to coach an entire football team and make decisions and deal with all that noise and stress. Personally speaking, the last time I had a 103-degree fever was back in 2012, and that was by far the sickest I've ever felt. I was sidelined from school with a variety of things for 2 weeks, and just felt like I wanted to die constantly and not leave my bed. Adding an extra degree onto that, plus my skin having bumps and turning purple? No way. However, despite all of that, Abe Gibron had a message to the hospital staff. "Let me out for this game. I'm going to coach. Yes, I'm sick. Yes, I'm in pain. Yes, I could potentially die. But I'm not missing this one. I'm going to coach this team." Said his wife Sue, Abe was released because he threatened to burn the place down if they tried to keep him away from the Bears game. That's right. Gibron threatened an act of arson. The only reason he was released from the hospital was because he threatened to burn down the entire building, thereby killing all the patients and the employees if he wasn't on the sideline for this game. And instead of the hospital employees and staff members keeping him confined to his room, or calling the cops, or not releasing him, since they knew he was not in good shape whatsoever, and it would be highly irresponsible to everyone involved to let him out there, they decided, well, he wants to coach this game. Let him coach. And with that, despite having a 104-degree fever, despite his body being in pain, and despite not being able to think whatsoever thanks to a pounding headache, which was definitely going to be made worse with the sound of over 48,000 fans at Soldier Field, and the sounds of the game, from whistles to collisions and everything in between, Abe Gibron was on the sideline. And amazingly enough, when all was said and done, for the first time in Abe Gibron's entire career, he coached a team that was above 500. Because the Bears somehow won this game by a final score of 17-9, in a game that wasn't even that close, as you could tell from these highlights, seeing as the Bears led it 17-0 midway through the third quarter. So they had a 3-possession lead with little time left in the contest, relatively speaking. It was a massive upset that no one saw coming, especially since Vegas had the Lions as 8.5-point favorites, and especially since Gibron had been embarrassed all 4 previous times against Detroit. But the Bears absolutely came to play on this day. Their defensive line destroyed Detroit's passing game, as quarterback Bill Munson got sacked 5 times. In fact, Bill Munson completed less than 50% of his passes, going 13 for 28, while throwing no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, throwing for just 67 net passing yards, and posting a passer rating of 26.8, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball to the ground on every single play. Chicago stopped the run, holding the Lions to just 89 rushing yards on 3.4 yards per carry, and they held the Lions to just 9 first downs and 156 yards of total offense throughout the entire game. Combine that with the big play explosion of Charlie Wade, the great running of Jim Harrison, who had over 4 yards per carry for Chicago on 50 rushing yards, and the great defense of Chicago in terms of preventing the big play, seeing as the Lions only had 1 play go for 20-plus yards, and that was a 21-yard grab, and this was a shockingly great performance from Chicago to open up the 1974 campaign. And it was led by a head coach with a 140-degree fever who had no business being on the sideline, seeing as he was in danger of dying, and seeing as he was potentially 1 bad fall away from something absolutely catastrophic happening. After the game, Gibron did not eat dinner, with his appetite still terrible despite not having eaten since Friday, and he was readmitted to the hospital, though he would start to feel better soon and would work on the game plan for Week 2 against the New York Jets on his hospital bed by connecting and communicating with the team via telephone. Somehow, this all worked out. Now look, Abe Gibron was obviously not a great head coach. No one's going to pretend otherwise. But you can't deny that he was one of a kind. And this exhibit from a 1974 game against Detroit to open up the season truly shows that. From getting admitted to the hospital with a ton of pain and a life-threatening fever, to threatening to commit arson if he can't coach, to then winning the game against all odds. That's quite the chain of events. Because to open up the 1974 season, the only thing that Abe Gibron was hungry for wasn't food. It was to be on the sidelines and guide his team to a long overdue victory against the Detroit Lions. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.